On?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It's been a while. About 3 weeks ago, we finished our textual criticism study, and then 2 weeks ago, Eric Patterson had a short one study with you all, and then, of course, last week we had the power failure. Pretty much blew having any meeting whatsoever for the first hour. So this week, before we get into the study of John, I wanted to just do a sort of small study before that to help us understand the interpretation of things. And so it's actually pretty critical. It's a study on the biblical framework is what I'm calling it. And it could be 4 weeks, it could be a few more after that. Part of that can depend upon your interest in a particular subject matter. So if you have, for instance, this translates out into other areas, for instance, the end times, the tribulation and the millennium and many of those things, but also with the scope of evangelism, how we do it. You may have heard the term like easy believism, something like that. That factors into this discussion here. And the idea also that all of us, whether we know it or not, or whether we recognize it, we're all to some extent theologians. We all have understandings about God, and we apply them in our lives. And so it's best, hopefully, like we had studied weeks before about Jeremiah 9:24. It says, "Let him who boasts in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord." We went over that many times, but it's certainly incumbent upon us, and Christ calls us to understand him and the ways of God as much as possible. Okay, so knowing him should help guide us about his ways, his plans, and purposes. Not that we understand everything, because many things will be mysterious. We won't know what's going on many times, but we still can trust him. And I think that's the important matter here. So part of this study, in a lot of ways, is somewhat to inform you of this material. And it could be sort of like, I report, you decide. But to a certain extent, even everybody has a bias in how they understand what their theology is. So many times I think a class will sort of follow whatever the teacher it sways them to, either because he intends to or unintentionally. But at any rate, I at least would like you to be aware of this material and what it's about and how it influences you, okay? So I have to say that, where is Brent? Is he crawling up the stairs?
No, he's in another
He's
vehicle.
in another vehicle, sorry, okay.
Yeah,
All
I'm
right.
sorry.
That's
What-
all right. So,
No.
but in some aspects, I may try to persuade you on a viewpoint of what I hold about the biblical frameworks, okay? But, again, I approach the subject with some trepidation, and I do that because this subject can be a source of conflict, and it oftentimes is in the sense that, there are denominations, you won't necessarily hear them named like this, but there'll be sort of particular churches that line up with a biblical framework, okay? And we'll go over those shortly in a while there. And secondarily, I approach it with trepidation because I have accountability before the Lord to present this material in a way, hopefully that is the correct understanding of it. But we're all fallible human beings, right? So obviously we want to do the best way that we can, present it in the most honest way. Oftentimes, another reason why it sometimes gets a little bit difficult to discuss the matter is because oftentimes labels will be applied. And sometimes labels can be, there's this sort of a passive aggressiveness to them in the sense that you can give somebody a label and it's a way of sort of smearing them without smearing them, okay? For instance, you may have heard the word replacement theology. You ever heard of that word? Okay, the idea is the church replaces Israel, okay? And so, you're one of those replacement theologists. Oh, you must be an anti-Semite, is sort of the thinking that goes along with this. So labels you gotta be careful how they are applied, but sometimes we just need to label something to make it easy to call it something, right? Okay, so another thing about this, sometimes once you get familiar with the understanding of the subject, there's certain code words that you'll hear that will trip you off into saying, oh, I know where this person's going. I know what this person believes, okay? For instance, if Aaron gives a particular sermon and he says something like, oh, I know what he's talking about there, but he's not going into depth on it because he doesn't want to bring up a lot of other issues and material. He's being kind of very sort of an overview of things lots of times without getting into detail. And I think he wants to be subtle about certain subject matter. He doesn't want a lot of, conflict and misunderstanding. And I think it's sort of a gradual, you might say, I don't want to say indoctrination per se, but teaching, a gradual exposure to some of this material so it becomes familiar with you so that you aren't suddenly, wait a minute, where are you going with this stuff here, okay? So you'll hear, you'll see things like this. But anyway, in particular, the reason why we're doing it right now is because if we go into the Gospel of John, this material is actually very relevant to us. And it's important that we understand how it influences our understanding of the scriptures, the subject matter, especially in something like the Gospel of John, okay? So we won't get into that today, but you'll see it as we go along. So in many ways, this subject could warrant, you could go a year easily on this material here. We're definitely not going to do anything like that. So it just gets you kind of familiar with it, gets your feet wet and all in it, so that it becomes kind of comfortable with you and all, some of the terminology, and also just there's certain things that I want us to understand here, and I put them on your handouts there. Okay, so why are we doing this study? I put down there, and the first reason is to expose inconsistencies in our theological beliefs, in our beliefs about God. We want to expose inconsistencies, how we're thinking. Are we just changing our minds about something? One text we think of things this way, another text we'll think of things another way. So we like to be consistent. I mean, when you talk to somebody, you don't want somebody, yesterday you liked color blue, now you hate it. I mean, simple things like that. But we want to be consistent in how we approach the Bible. Because oftentimes what we'll do is we'll pick up little pieces of doctrine like we're at a cafeteria. Okay, oh look, I like that dish there, and that dish that's how I understand the millennium, or something like that, or this is how I understand salvation and all. So we need to know we should be consistent in how we view things. Okay, or even so we talked about like end times, but even taking a position on how the law of God affects our lives. Okay, I'm just going to leave it at that rather than go into detail on that. So secondly, I've got to know, that's item A, to know what we believe and why we believe it. Okay, that's kind of basic. You'd like to know what you believe, and you'd have a good reason for believing what you believe, right? All right, so it should guide us into a more consistent and defensible position there. So we want to be able to somewhat defend why we believe something. And as a consequence, the second word there in 1B, to know God's word better, don't write too big, keep the letter small, and know the God of the word better. To know God's word better and know the God of the word better. Okay, so we want to know the scriptures as well as the author of the scriptures.
Did you have a thing for number 1, framework we accept and use? Is that to study the Bible? Or?
No, I might have a different sheet on. Yeah, it was what was it again?
The framework we accept and use.
Impacts our understanding of the text. I'm sorry, I totally missed that one. Impacts our understanding of the text.
Our or
Our. Yeah. All right.
Impact.
Our understanding.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. All right, and moreover,
Of the text.
it should also give us should help us appreciate the views of. Appreciate the views of others. That's number 2. Appreciate the views of others. On this particular study, in this matter. If we do it properly, we should better appreciate the logic, the rationale, the reasoning for why somebody may choose a different viewpoint, a different vantage point on this subject, right? So we need to appreciate the views of others, that others definitely do have different views. And we appreciate the opposing view because it was done with their best effort at understanding and all, and they may not never have been shown more information on the subject to have known to make a different choice, okay? So the caution in here is that can be significant, that's number A, 2A, significant conflict and disagreement can occur between believers regarding these views. Okay, so sometimes, not just conflicts, these things can be open to little open debates and even somewhat battles, okay, theological battles. You can certainly see them on the internet, you can see all kinds of people take one position, one side and the other, and they'll get a name calling, but they'll say these crazy people, they think this way and so forth. So we need to understand that there's conflict and disagreement in there, and what we want to do is be able to take that friction away, take that fear away, the idea that I'm scared because somebody's going to challenge me with a different position. So we need to be able to understand it, and so that leads us into the important difference is the two positions are not essential Christian dogma. Essential Christian dogma. In other words, you can take a position in one of these things, and it doesn't mean it's heresy, okay, if you choose one and not the other. There are good people, great Christians on both sides of this debate, okay? So it's just to make sure that we understand you can be a Christian and you can believe in certain biblical framework, which we'll get into the names of them very shortly, okay? All right, so this is not like formal heresy. Remember we were going through all that stuff about the Trinity. We had Arianism, remember that? And there was Gnosticism and things like, and modalism. This is not like that, okay? There are differences. The differences are significant in what they're going to lead to, but it's not, a heresy. It can seem like heresy, but anyway. So we approach the subject with humility and grace. Okay. So I'm just kind of prepping us to get understand. So
You're scaring everybody, is what you're doing.
I know. Humility in that we understand we're fallible beings and fallible in our understanding. Okay. Grace in that we have been forgiven and given grace for salvation. And therefore, we will extend that grace to others. So I know we're not going to mock, but the next one, we won't mock, ridicule, or deride others' beliefs. Okay? Mock, ridicule, deride. We're not going to make fun of and call names and things like that. So we're being very respectful. But I think there's the idea that it's appropriate to go ahead and challenge somebody in the sense that very respectfully. So, have you thought about that position through? Have you really understood the consequences of what you're thinking about? Okay, does it make sense? So, yes.
Deride. I don't understand deride.
Deride, D-E-R-I-D, deride. Kind of ridicule. It's really a redundant term. The ridicule, mock. Yeah. Okay, so, but understand. It's okay to do a little light joking, okay? So just to be humorous sometimes, to break the tension, and to just say, we're all human beings. We're all fallible human beings. So we can have a little fun at each other. If we can't have any humor sometimes, it really makes it terrible to think that you can't say anything without, offending somebody. So I'm on a picture that way. Okay. So let's see, perhaps,
You're on number 4.
Okay, and number 3, so the other one, okay, let me just go through, a little bit, we're still on number 3, okay, we're between 2 and 3 here, we're about to start on 3 in just a moment. So the understanding is that, sometimes we can just put too much emphasis on a subject, like the millennium or something like that, and it's driving our doctrine, it's driving our whole worldview kind of a thing. So just realize that. And we look at a subject like the Hayes Hills doctrinal statement, the statement of faith, and also the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 doctrinal statement. There's no mention of what they believe in terms of this biblical framework. It's sort of like it's left out because if you put it in there, it just sort of triggers things and so forth. So you just want to leave it so that they keep you guessing. Okay, if I were to announce, like I was afraid, if I put in here, we're studying biblical frameworks and stuff, and well, nobody might come, but anyway, but it's important, I think. It's an important subject, and you will find certain churches, they're very, very explicit about this matter, okay? It's in their doctrinal statement and all, and it's very clear and concise. We look at the Hayes Hills elders, the leaders of this church. There's a broad, several of them are on one side of the debate and versus the other side. So we don't hold it against each other in that regard. Very respectful of opinion. And you can hold, in the same church, both sides. It's not an issue sometimes. But it definitely impacts how they will present the scriptures to you. It is very, very impactful on that, okay? So, the intention here, so I'm going to be sort of neutral. Well, that's the idea of not putting it into a doctrinal statement, is to be neutral, to avoid conflict and all. And typically, the less specified you present something in a doctrinal statement, then it enables it to be more inclusive, okay? So when you're more explicit, you're going to be separating things more, right? So that's kind of like why things are done that way. We don't want to steer people away before they've even heard what we're talking about. So anyway, that's how things go. So we recognize that we have no perfect theological system. That's number 3. We have no perfect theological system.
It's number 4.
Number 4, or we call which you could put in parentheses next to that, biblical framework. That's what we're calling a biblical framework. Is essentially a theological system. There's always going to be disconnects. There's always going to be gaps, and there's going to be holes. There are periods where we cannot explain certain things based upon the theological system that we hold, is what I'm saying. And you're going to see some of these things as we go along. There's going to be like, well, explain to me this, Batman, and you're just not going to be able to do it, okay? Or you can always make up an explanation, but it just may not sound as like, really like it ought to sound like. Okay, so because there's no perfect biblical framework, we live with tension. We live with the fact that we are unsatisfied with everything. We'd like to have good explanations, but we don't. The Lord leaves us in somewhat of a state of, you might say, trust, and I don't want to say confusion per se, but it's just a state of like, keep looking for the answers. Don't give up. Keep
Sounds
looking.
like he wants us to trust him.
Absolutely.
And not depend on our
Own understanding.
Right.
own
But
understanding.
Interpretation.
Right, but the idea is that he does want us to know this material. It is, basic, and I think it's important as Christians that we attempt to learn it. All right. So with all that information there, did I get to the next one? Let's see. The biblical, okay.
What
do I
did you
do?
say for the biblical
The
framework?
biblical framework, you can put in there, or parentheses, theological system held informs our worldview. And the idea there is that what you believe affects your behavior, okay? It affects how are you going to work out your theology in the real world, okay? It will impact that. There are consequences to how you think. These consequences can be political, okay? Or they can also just be how you're going to live out your life, what lifestyle choices you're going to think on, how you do evangelism, and all sorts of things, okay? So there are consequences to it. Now, what I'd like to do is move our subject into what is called the meta-narrative, because this helps us understand the framework. But anybody ever heard of the term meta-narrative before? Okay. So you've heard of narrative. Now, what is a narrative? A story. That's the easiest thing. It's a story, okay? And the thing is that we find in the Bible, are there stories?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, tons of them, right? And a storyline is something like being narrated, or you're told a story, basically. And narrate is meaning telling, and kind of like the Latin. So the Bible is stories, but they're not fairy tales, right? They're not by any means fairy tales. But they're records of actions, consequences, results, and events. And there are, okay, tell me just a couple of narratives in the book of Genesis?
Story of Adam and Eve.
Adam and Eve. What else?
Creation.
Creation, okay. A little further in the book.
Flood, Noah and the flood.
Okay, Noah and the flood.
Tower of Babel.
Tower of Babel.
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel. Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Or
Abraham.
Jacob and Esau, right? And also Joseph and that whole long story there, right? All those narrations. You go into Exodus, and all you obviously have plagues. Remember the Exodus itself, obviously. So there's all these narratives, and you wonder, when you see these, they just happen, or is there something stringing them along that makes it like something's being accomplished? So is God just winging it, so to speak, or is he?
Timeline.
He's got a timeline, okay, and so he's actually is he accomplishing something?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So that's what we are calling the thread that you might say that combines all these different stories is what we're calling the grand storyline or the meta-narrative, okay? And then we can describe meta-narrative as the story about the stories. What do I have there?
Yeah.
The meta-narrative is a story about stories, or the grand narrative. It's the big picture, okay?
So you're saying meta is grand?
Say that again?
You said meta-narrative, so you broke it down
It's
into
the grand-
narrative, so meta is grand?
Meta can be several different things. It can be above, kind of like above, so it has that understanding in a translation. It can be above, so it's a story above the other stories. That's what I'm getting at. When we talked about, I used to work in the oceanography community, and we had what was called, you had the data about, you might have a system that collects data, maybe the depth of the floor of the ocean that you're under. And then we have what was called the metadata, which meant the data about the data. So you might have, you're measuring depth of water, right? So the metadata, the data about the data, would be, where were you? What was the geographic location? What were the conditions of the weather? What was the equipment you were using, and so forth like that? Who was using it? All kinds of different things you could say. The metadata, the data about the data. In this case, the meta-narrative is the narrative about the narrative, all these other narratives. It puts them all together. So when we look at this, it's not just God winging it, that there really is a purpose. And probably the foundational purpose that we find begins, at least why we have all these stories in the Bible, Genesis 3:15. I didn't print it here, so we're not going to have a whole lot of Bible verses today, so I'll just read that one. And it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. Remember, this is right after the fall. He's talking to the snake. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And what is that? What is that kind of looking at? What is that telling us? What's that verse talking about?
About Jesus
Okay.
Crushing.
Satan.
Yes, exactly. There's going to be a battle, right? That's what you can see that there's a conflict here. And it doesn't, it's sort of, you might say it's a bit cryptic. I mean, you can't understand exactly all the details, but you know there's something that's coming here. And it doesn't say how long it's going to take, right? There's nothing in there about that. No timetable when it's going to happen. Describes a war. It's sort of a minimal amount of prophecy. It involves some kind of suffering by the victor, but then obviously a clear defeat of the one who's defeated. So that little verse there, Genesis 3:15, kind of begins the storyline right after the creation of all these other events that happen, all through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and so forth, all those other books of the Bible, and clear into the New Testament, right? So that's kind of
basically saying that God is saying that his son will end Satan? Is that what you just said? Or did I miss it all?
What I'm saying is that when it talks about Genesis 3:15, when it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, he's talking to the snake who sort of has embodied, Satan, and the Eve at that point. So he's going to say the seed of her, who will eventually be Christ, is going to do battle against you, and he will win. He will crush your head, but you will bruise his heel. You're going to inflict pain and suffering you might say.
Right.
But it will not be fatal. Yours is gonna be fatal, his is not gonna be fatal. That's what I'm getting at.
Okay.
Does that make?
Yes.
Okay, so we see that begins this whole story. And later on, in the road to Emmaus, remember in Luke chapter 24, as Jesus is walking with the two disciples, they don't know who, they don't recognize him, and they say to him, there's this guy who's with all this action happening in Jerusalem, and Jesus says to him, what are you talking about? And then they tell him. And then Jesus says, oh, you foolish of heart, don't you understand all this was basically to present to you Christ. It was the story of Christ. I didn't put the verse down, I'm sorry about that. But anyway, so I did write it down. Luke 24:27. And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So this meta-narrative embodies all these actions, these stories about Christ. So we see Jesus as the promised seed from Genesis to Malachi, all the way to Revelation, being the subject of the scriptures. So all these narratives in the Bible, the ones that we mentioned in Genesis and Exodus and all the others that are unmentioned, they basically bring to us they're not meaningless stories, but they're bringing us somewhere. They're showing us Christ and presenting to us salvation and an end point. So the common thread, the meta-narrative. So, as I said, the meta-narrative is a story about stories of the grand narrative. I'll read you a paragraph just so you help understand, solidify this. This is from gotquestions.org. A meta-narrative, also called a grand narrative, is an overarching story or storyline that gives context, meaning, and purpose to all of life. A meta-narrative is the big picture or all-encompassing theme that unites all the smaller themes and individual stories. In building a house, there are many workers doing many individual jobs. Plumbing, sheetrock, electrical work, roofing. But all those contractors are working toward the same thing, right? They're building a house. They want completing it. The blueprint is the big picture, the meta-narrative that gives meaning to each contractor's work. The plumbing isn't fitting pipes to nowhere. He's involved in a larger scheme, all right? So when we look at the Bible, sometimes theologians will look at a four sequence approach as representing the meta-narrative. You can write this down. Fundamental storyline of the Bible: creation, fall, redemption. Anybody want to take a guess at the last one?
Eternity?
Restoration, I'm sorry. Creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And that sort of fits it, right? You see creation, obviously, is a major event. The fall occurs, and that starts the whole sequence of the rest of the story. And then that whole story is defined as a redemption story. And then after that, there is still a restoration that happens when we have the new heaven and the new earth. Okay? So that's sort of a four-phase breakout quickly of what we would call the meta-narrative of the Bible. Now, we talked about meta-narrative. We talked a little bit about biblical framework. So let's tie the two together. Okay? So we look at what we call, we're going to tie in the meta-narrative with the biblical framework. And the biblical framework is how, this is the next one down, is how the meta-narrative is accomplished. Biblical framework is how the meta-narrative is accomplished. It's the means, the methods, the ways in which God accomplishes the meta-narrative. So it's not the individual stories, but the structures, it's the tools that are put in place to accomplish it. So it's kind of like we had the picture of the room, you're building a house and so forth. So you could think of, in one sense, as the tour you're taking through the various rooms. You go through the foyer and then to the kitchen and then to the dining room and so forth like that. Well, that's kind of the storyline. That's how you're getting through there. But the rooms, the structure that storyline goes through, the structure is the biblical framework. Okay? So this is the story has to go through this room because that's the structure, that's the framework that is presented to you. Okay? So the biblical framework becomes and it becomes the do I even have it on it? Okay. I don't have it on it.
Yeah, you do.
Yes.
Biblical framework, okay, well, we're gonna get to, I'm not quite there yet. So what happens, I should have had this under. Biblical framework becomes the lens through which we consciously or subconsciously understand the scriptures, okay?
You
So,
had that on there.
I do.
Yeah.
I'm so smart.
I know, you scare me.
I scare myself, as my father used to say. Biblical framework becomes the lens through which we consciously or subconsciously understand the scriptures. So lots of times we will approach the scriptures in different ways, okay? But anytime you're looking, you're either obviously going to have like a color of lens that you see things through. In this case, it's either the green lens or the orange lens, right? And whichever lens we put on is we're going to see how that flavors the scriptures. It's going to impact our understanding. And that framework basically is the lens through which we're going to interpret things. Okay? The two biblical frameworks that are in Orthodox Christianity are called basically covenant theology. Covenant theology, you can put down, or Reformed theology, but basically you can call it covenant theology, and dispensational theology.
What was the second one?
Dispensational theology. So sometimes you can call them by dispensationalism, and the second one, covenantalism. Okay. I'll go over quickly what these are momentarily. Dispensationalism and covenantalism. So dispensationalism means dispensational theology. Covenantalism means covenant theology. Okay. So, have you ever heard of these terms? Any of you? Oh, you have.
I mean, this is, I can't even say the word,
Yes.
this means to give out knowledge, right? To
You're
spread.
thinking of dispensing something.
Yeah.
Like, here, I'm going to dispense cash to you. I'm going to dispense knowledge to you. It's different than that.
Okay.
That is one of the definitions you could use in a dictionary. It's a separate definition that we're thinking of in the theological sense. Okay? All right. So, when we think of a dispensation, okay, a dispensation in the biblically speaking is like it's a period of time under which certain rules operate. Okay? So, now just think in terms of your own life. You have children, right? At some point in time, as they grow, they're going to be under a different dispensation with you. So as they grow, as they get to be a teenager, all right, you're going to want to give them responsibilities to do, right? And all. They have some authority, more authority. Maybe you give them a cell phone and that sort of thing. So a different dispensation is how the rules, how are you going to operate within them, okay? They're going to change as you go along. Okay, the child gets older, they get married or obviously become an adult and so forth. Well, that's totally different, you might say, dispensation, how you operate with them, okay? And how the rules go. When they're youngins, just little children, well, you're dictating them the rules far more often, far more clearly and all, but as they get older, you're giving them some liberty and all, and they have to make their own choices. That's a different dispensation, a different way of operation, okay? Because things have changed. Okay, now we look at a covenant. I know you've heard of covenants. You may not have heard of covenantalism. What's a covenant?
An agreement.
An agreement,
Based
right?
on-
There's the most obvious one, the marriage covenant, right? So you agree, it's not just merely a contract, okay? It's more than just a contract, but business-wise, you can think of it as a contract. What's another often use of the word covenant in where you may live?
Like-
An HOA
Right.
covenant, for instance, would be one, okay? There's covenants that, all around that you're not really thinking of so much, but a covenant is something in agreement, kind of like. So as we look through these two things, we look at how the Bible, is it done dispensationally or is it done covenantally? Now, the thing I want to say to you is that every Christian believes, somewhat educated Christian believes in dispensations in the scriptures, okay? For instance, did you bring a lamb with you to service, to sacrifice today? No. well, golly, you're a dispensationalist. Okay, in the sense, so there's clearly, you recognize something has changed, okay? So there's a dispensation that has changed. So we all have some element of understanding dispensationalism, and we are all dispensationalists to an extent, okay? On the other hand, do we also accept the new covenant when we do the Lord's Supper? Yeah, we mention that every time. So we're also covenantalists. So there's a certain sense in which that we understand dispensations, we understand covenants, and so we sort of accept some awareness that we're both of that persuasion. But just because we believe in dispensations does not make us a dispensationalist, okay? Do you remember when we were looking at the Trinity study and we had the idea of subordination and subordinationism, okay? Remember, Christ subordinates himself to the Father, okay? In the economic Trinity, going back weeks. I don't know if all that stuff has cleared your mind there, but the idea was that Christ submits himself. He subordinates himself to the Father. We believe in that. But we're not subordinationalists in the sense that we believe that is within the Trinity itself, okay? Within what they're called the ontological Trinity, if you remember that. So, likewise, the same way, we can believe in dispensations without being necessarily a dispensationalist. You can believe in covenants without being a covenantalist, okay? Does that make sense?
Well, God made covenants with us.
Indeed he did. Indeed he did.
And we broke them, but he never did.
Yeah, yeah. So obviously you were a covenantalist. Thank you for identifying yourself.
I'm just saying what's in the Bible
Yes.
is that God definitely has covenants
Yes.
that he.
And that's an important fact, is that both of these words are actually in the Bible, okay? There's clarity in them, but how the dispensation is a slightly different term than we use here in the theological sense, but don't worry about that right now. I just want to make the point that believing in covenants does not make you a covenantalist in the way of a framework, okay? And also believing in dispensations does not make you a dispensationalist in the sense of a biblical framework, okay?
So, are you talking about like when we first get saved, we're like a babe,
Yeah.
okay? And as we grow older, our relationship with God changes. It should deepen.
Yes, but that is not the idea of what we're talking about dispensational theology here. Yeah, I was just using the example of as children and all in our own lives because it made clear what the idea of a dispensation was. When we look at dispensations in the Bible, it's different. We're looking at certain events that cause a dispensation to trigger. Okay, we'll get into that not today. But I just wanted to make that clear.
So when Christ died on the cross and was raised, that caused a dispensationalism because if things change from that period forward.
That would certainly be where you would trigger a dispensation. Yes, good point. Yep. And we'll look at those things, but not today. We just wanted to introduce the subject.
But it also ushered in the new covenant.
You guys are so on top of it. I mean, it's good. So, real quickly, when we look at the idea of a biblical framework, this terminology was really kind of came up in about the 1500s. So it's kind of latter part of church history, 1500s. If we look at versus 100 AD or so when things got really kicking. So it took a while for the church to develop, and you mean, why did it take so long to develop this kind of understanding, this kind of theology, you might say? Anybody have any thoughts?
Yeah, they had together everything, all the knowledge together. It was
That's-
spread out all over the place.
Very true. The scriptures were in different, or they had to get a collection of the total, or at least a good understanding of many of the scriptures, the Gospels. I mean, we talked about, the textual stuff a few weeks ago, textual criticism and gathering manuscripts and so forth. So that's critical. You need the content, the material itself, right?
And then you got to remember in those times, people woke up, crack of dawn, they went to bed.
They didn't have a whole lot of time, right?
No, they didn't.
They're just trying to eke out a living.
Yeah.
And that's very true. And beyond that, I'll add, there was a lot of persecution. So you were running for your life. You didn't have necessarily time to sit there and write out a treatise on this stuff. You were just trying to survive and live and all. So yes, I think we have to give an appreciation for what those people were going through. But still they were able to do a lot. Not necessarily to the thing that we're talking about here, but at least comment on things, write about things, what they were. So really, it was wonderful that they were able to do anything. At any rate, but that there's fighting, there's persecution, they're fighting heresy, okay? All these things that they're trying to do. They're fighting a lot of ignorance, like you said, subsistence, lifestyle, wars, and things of that nature. So in order to get our appetite whet on this subject a little bit, what I've done is I put down there a drawing there of Old Testament and New Testament truth, okay? And I have on there, is that right there? Okay. We have the Old T and then the NT, right? Old Testament, New Testament. Okay. So the question I want to ask to sort of trigger some, how we think about things is this juncture right here, okay? Something happens, right? Obviously, Christ comes, and where's Brent?
It didn't show up.
You'll have to talk to him.
Okay.
I'm not his
Okay.
keeper, fortunately.
Okay, so the probing question for Christians, write this on your sheet. What do we do with the Old Testament? Okay, that's a question I want to ask you. Just real quickly. How do you look at the Old Testament now?
If we didn't have the Old Testament, we wouldn't know the storyline. Why did Jesus come and die on the
Very
cross?
good, okay.
I mean, the Old Testament is giving us how God has been faithful to us
Yes.
from the very beginning,
Yes.
and how unfaithful and how
Yeah, so,
disobedient
yes,
Israel and Judah and us
and man, right, and mankind, yes, yes.
we're not,
Okay, so it gives us a whole lot of background information, right? Okay,
and you need background information to understand the New Testament.
Right. All these
Without
prophecies.
the background of the Old Testament, the New Testament doesn't make sense.
right. So when we look at the Old Testament, like, what are some of the big themes that happen in the Old Testament? What sort of like just words? Just kick them out to me. Any words that come to mind?
Beginning.
Beginning, creation. Okay. Okay.
Well, what you were saying before, the creation, fall, redemption, and restoration.
Okay. Okay. Well, give me some other names. Don't think of those names there, but what are some of the big?
10 Commandments.
Okay, the law.
The law.
Bingo. The law. Okay. And it's more than just simply the 10 Commandments. It's all that stuff and all those books, right? The sacrifice, the ceremonial system, and all that kind of stuff, right? Okay. What else?
God's chosen people.
Say again?
God's chosen people,
Israel, right? Okay.
Israel got divided though.
Oh yeah, right. Exactly. Sure. I just look at it as a whole, though. Just don't bother with that. And what else? Well, there's a bunch of covenants in there, right?
Yeah.
Abrahamic,
Right.
The kings and
Mosaic.
prophets.
Kingdom, sure, and then some of that stuff a little bit, yeah. So, what happens when we hit this juncture here?
it's a new covenant.
What
But-
goes through?
Well, the law has been satisfied,
Okay.
so we don't need that anymore.
Do you not really? Because there's a lot of law mentioned in the New Testament. Don't murder.
He has
you know,
not
all
come
kinds
to
of things.
what
Sure
is
about
it?
that?
Abolish the law.
Abolish the bar, but to fulfill it.
The law has been fulfilled
Okay.
by Christ dying on the cross and
What does-
rising from the dead.
What does that mean for us? Does that mean, well, it's good, now we can do what we want?
No, it means that we are in Christ and we want to do as Christ.
Okay.
No longer seeking Christ, because we already have him.
Well,
Oh, okay,
I mean,
okay.
You have to.
Okay, but do you see where we're going to here? We have all these things in the Old Testament, and then we come to the juncture with the New Testament. Well, what do? We just look at the Old Testament as like a bunch of stories. Okay, it's a storyline of the Bible, you might say. But it's just like we look at stories of David and Goliath, or Daniel and the lions, and so forth like that. Are they just sort of moralistic stories, or is there more than that, in essence, of what comes through in terms of God's kingdom, his covenants, the story of Israel, the law, and so forth like that. So this is where the biblical framework is important because it's going to determine in one element, just one element, what happens here.
The
What do
law
you
is
do
written
with
on
the-
your heart instead
Okay.
of just.
Oh, well, very good, right. But the point is that this is the lens, it's going to interpret these things for us, okay? This is why it's important that we know this. What, in one area, what happens at this juncture?
Christ comes in.
It's just a rhetorical question.
Sacrifice.
Okay,
So-
all right, so when we look at it in
Receiving
another
the Holy
way.
Spirit.
So
to guide us.
when that happened,
Yeah,
when Jesus came, we were given a path at that point.
we were given a what?
A
Path.
path. to
Path,
follow.
okay,
And so, even though we can never live a perfect life,
yeah,
we were given a path to try to achieve as much as we can to a perfect life, right?
I'm assuming you're saying we receive the Holy Spirit who empowers us
Yes.
to live a life, the Christian life. you might
And we
say.
were given grace.
Yes, true.
Without grace, we would still all be.
Very true. So what you're saying is true, and that this is why I want us to think about these things, because they influence how we're going to look at the scriptures. We look at the book of John. There's in what they call the prologue, the first 18 verses of John. It says things like, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus, right? So this kind of now becomes a bit more interesting about why this is important, how we understand things. I'm not going to go into detail on that, but another idea of this difference here. So this is a different picture here, okay? And I'm going to look at these two frameworks in a. Can you see, Blaine? I need to put this on. Draw that line again, okay? And we have something called. You can put this on your sheet. Discontinuity. And you can put an arrow here, meaning from
So this line is discontinued.
little discontinuity
Yeah.
to the most discontinuity, okay? And remember, you're thinking back about that other diagram I just drew with the juncture at the old, are we discontinuous or is there continuity? So how much continues, you might say, from the Old Testament into the New Testament? Or is it just completely discontinuous? Is it just hitting a wall and then we just, okay, we appreciate all the stories, we know how they work and everything, the storyline, but do those things that happen in the Old Testament, is there any continuity that we have with them? And the thing that we look at, continuity, the things that focus on continuity is covenantalism, or covenant theology if you wish.
Dispensation.
They focus on continuity. Okay? Discontinuity would obviously be
Dispensation.
dispensationalism. Just like you had mentioned, Peggy, grace, you mentioned about that. We see that, obviously, when I mentioned that verse in John, okay? We look at grace, and so they would say the law is not, you don't obey the law in the same way that we did with the Old Testament sort of stuff. But I'll categorize that differently in another study. But do you see how dispensationalism will looking at discontinuities between the Old and the New Testament, whereas covenantalism tries to focus on continuity, that there are things that still flow through. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, the big word that causes all this, there's one word that this all kind of balances on. Does anybody want to take a guess at what that word is? I'll help you out. Starts with an L and it ends with an L.
Legalism? I mean, legal?
No. It's a good guess though.
And two L's.
Oh, right, I'm thinking, okay. But that's not the word. Okay. L-I-T, literal is what I'm getting at. This is the word that basically everything sort of balances upon. Which way are you going to go? You're going to go more towards discontinuity or more towards continuity. And as we'll find out in the next class, we'll look at how this causes this to be so important, the idea of literalism.
So that goes in this bottom blank, one key word that determines where you see
Yes,
continuity.
literal. Yeah,
Literal.
literal. Yeah. So, real quickly, just a few more minutes here. Oftentimes, people will look at what establishes the validity of like a framework or doctrine is the age of the doctrine. So they'll say, "Oh, you can't believe in dispensationalism. It's so young. It's only 200 years old." Okay, versus we talk about covenantalism. Well, it's only 500 years old. It's really they're both kind of young. Okay, covenantalism is older, but that's not the argument by which you establish something is right or not. You have to ask, is it right or not based on the merits of what they're saying, right? Not necessarily on how old thing it is. But, age is certainly important on something like this. So, the idea of the biblical framework is not just to figure out that bridge between the Old and New Testaments, but we want to understand that when we look at them, there's reasons for this that include what we call biblical hermeneutics. Remember what hermeneutics is? Anybody have any recollection of that? How you interpret the Bible, how you interpret it. And so we'll get into more of these things as we go along. But realize either subconsciously or consciously, you're looking through those lenses. You're taking the Bible and you're looking through a lens either of continuity or discontinuity in the Bible. Okay? Any questions? There's a lot there, but I didn't want to go super deep. I just wanted to get us introduced to it. And as we walk through this, we'll begin to see much more how this applies to our understanding of the scriptures. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to pray us out here.